Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
My sponsor, Barry W., had a chance to hear this morning's speaker at Yosemite last Thanksgiving, I believe. He came back with high words of praise for him. So with that as an introduction, I'd like you to meet Father Tom from Oakland.
My name is Tom, and I am an alcoholic. I've been out of the country for a couple of months, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that before I deal with more familiar things. I spent a couple of months in Stockholm, Sweden, working and at a parish there, and I've worked there before, and AA exists in Sweden, and I was familiar with the fellowship and met people, and we're growing well there, just to let you know that. But I bumped into one group that fascinated me, and I just thought I'd mention them to you because it's not something that we hear about very often. AA also exists in Finland. And there's over 3,000 members of the fellowship in Finland right now, and there was a big convention this summer, and they all went nuts for a weekend, just like you did here. And about 1,000 people got together and stayed sober in Finnish, which is phenomenal. But how did AA get to Finland? And the way it got to Finland was there was this Finnish sailor who ended up in the Bay Area up north and got sober in Burlingame. And he was sober 2 or 3 or 4 months, and he wrote a letter to his best friend in Helsinki, said, "I'm sober, and this is how it worked, and there are 12 steps." And it's just amazing how this, anyway, his friend got the letter and got sober and Xeroxed the letter and passed it out to his friends, and they started the first AA group in Finland, you see. And part of the Finnish sense of humor, at some of the meetings in Helsinki, they pass out photographs of the mailbox in Burlingame that sent the letter, you see. In fact, when sober Finns come to San Francisco, they don't want to see the bridge and they don't want to see St. Mary's Cathedral. They want to go and see a mailbox in Burlingame. Hard to explain to the people in Burlingame. But more exciting for me at the end of the time there, a friend of mine and I, he is also sober, we went into Poland, met a sober Pole who was going to this conference in Helsinki, and I said, well, we were thinking of going to Poland to see a couple of things, and he said, well, where are you going to stay? And I said, we don't know, we just thought we'd kind of show up, you know, see what happens. And he said, well, give me some times and dates of when you're coming in, and I'll have AA people there to meet you. And he did. We showed up in Poznan knowing nothing, and 4 sober people were waiting for us. One of them could handle some English with a dictionary. And they set us up. In fact, we showed up in Poznan on a Saturday night. There's no meeting in Poznan on a Saturday night. They meet on Friday night. But because we were there, they had a meeting on Saturday night. and they all showed up. Could you imagine doing that here? You know, we'd like to meet again tomorrow night. It's against the traditions. You know. Which tradition are you talking about, brother? Anyway, Jim and I chaired the meeting, and we had people translating for us because, you know, my Polish is very weak. And very few people speak English there, and so we'd talk for a while and they'd translate, and then we did questions and answers, and it was kind of fun talking about, you know, the American experience of sobriety and how the traditions get going. And the meeting went on for 3 hours. And then finally we ended because we were tired. They were still real interested. Left there and went to Krakow, and in Krakow AA got started last October. The first meeting was held in Krakow in the middle of October of 1985, and we met the founders. And we had a meeting in the park. The one Al-Anon in the city of Krakow was there. And I told her we'd send some tapes. And we had 2 sober people. The fellow with the long-term sobriety in Krakow is 10 months sober. He's the expert, you know? It was amazing, and they were just filled with love. They met us at the train station. We were absolutely nuts, and they carried us somewhere else. And then we ended up in Warsaw. And again, people met us at the train station, and we stayed with sober folks in Warsaw, and we were taken around and introduced to people and just started to see people getting sober. The big book is not yet translated into Polish. It's still happening. But right now there are over 90 meetings a week in Poland. And we met the man in Poznan who, with his wife, sat at their kitchen table in a 2-room apartment plus bathroom, and they went with an English dictionary, word by word, translating the 12 by 12. You know? And they don't have Xerox machines, they use carbon paper. So you get to type out 3 copies and give it to someone else who types out 3 copies, who gives it to someone else, and they type out 3 more copies. These are people who are desperately wanting to be sober. The man we met in Warsaw, his name was Adam, and he has a wife and 2 kids. And I was telling, well, how does this work in Poland? And he says, well, first of all, we're not a legal organization, because legal organizations have to be registered with the state. And when you register with the state, you have to list your membership, and we can't do that. You know? So we're just kind of illegal. But 2 months ago, 3 months ago, in the communist newspaper that comes out once a month for the party officials, the lead article was on how AA works in California, written by a sober Pole in Santa Monica who sent a 5-page article on sobriety, and nowhere in there is the G-O-D word mentioned, but they talk a lot about people getting sober and well and sharing experience, strength, and hope, and they published it in the party organ, you know, because they figure there's a little drinking problem in Poland. Amazing. And we also, we were saying, well, you know, are there secret police around? Because of course all we know of Poland is from, you know, Twilight Zone and Mission Impossible. And he said, oh, we do have secret police and militia at our meetings, but they're sober. And one of the assistant chiefs of the military police in Warsaw was 12-stepped by a Solidarity member, who is now his sponsor. So if you have any time left over in your prayer, keep in mind our sisters and brothers in Poland who are beginning a whole new experience. I was just so moved and touched by the hospitality, the warmth, and the sobriety that was there that I felt like a newcomer. And it just felt sensational to be there. And we discover that there are bonds that unite us far beyond bonds of language and nationality. That it's a real profound bond of spirit that I knew nothing about when I came to this program. Nothing at all. I got sober. My last drink was the day that Gerald Ford, remember him, got nominated for President of the United States. And that's somewhere in the middle of August in 1976. It was during the Republican Convention, which I'm sure struck me sober. And I was not real glad to get sober, and I do meet some people who, and when they talk about coming to AA and just, they felt so good to be here immediately, and just between you and me, that's not my story. I am not a quick study of recovery, nor am I a quick study of gratitude. I used to hear people talking about, you know, my name is Sally and I'm a lucky alcoholic, and my name is Fred and I'm a grateful alcoholic, and you can only take so much of that. And when I was over a year sober, I moved into LA and started working down there. I lived there for 4 years sober. And I went out to a meeting one night in the San Fernando Valley, which is the moon. And there was a guy there who was talking about stuff. And, you know, talking, and he finally said, you know, I'm not grateful that I'm an alcoholic, but I'm real grateful that you are. And it was the first time that I could identify with the feeling of gratitude in sobriety. Because I still wasn't glad to be an alcoholic, but I was so glad that there were rooms filled with women and men who were sober that I could go to and connect with. And starting to make the humanization process, which is sobriety. My first meeting was in Oakland in 1976 on a Friday night, and I walked in there, and everybody in the room was very old, and very clean-shaven, and very straight, and had lots of tattoos, and they all wore socks. And I just didn't identify with anybody. The guy who was chairing the meeting had a little tiny white Tom Dewey mustache. Remember him? And he said that we all knew his story and he wouldn't bore us with it anymore. And he laughed, and they all laughed, and I laughed right along with him. Because if you're going to survive, laugh when the group laughs. I knew that. But I didn't get the joke. I thought I should have been here last week when he told his story, you know. What did I know? And then there was another guy at the meeting who said that he had a real good week and mentioned to us that he finally got up the psychic energy and sobriety and willpower and good living to cut the front lawn. And I did not want what he had. There was a married couple at the meeting, male-female, and they were married to each other, which is even more bizarre. And they were laughing together and talking together and having a wonderful time together in public. Now, I can't tell you the last time I had seen a married couple carry on like that, but it was the strangest thing. And then it was my turn to talk. And I said my name was Tom and I'm an alcoholic, and they all shouted back, "Hi, Tom," which takes some getting used to. By the way, we tried to introduce that custom to Poland, thinking that that is the way we do it here, that is the way they should do it there, you know. And so Jim and I would talk, and we would say, "Hi, Jim," and "Hi, Tom," and the Poles had this big conversation with themselves. And our translator turned to us and very politely said, "We're going to have to change the word hi." He said, "To us it sounds like Heil, and there are still some memories of World War II in this meeting." So they introduced a Polish word, cześć, which means hi. Cześć, Tom. That's one of the Polish words I learned. But anyway, I said, you know, you talk about what happened this past week, and I said that my name was Tom, I'm an alcoholic. I said my last drink was a Tuesday night. I did not tell them that it was only beer. and that it was in a pizza parlor, and I didn't even feel vaguely intoxicated. I just peed a lot. Footnote, if I had known that was going to be my last drink, I would have done it differently. I mean, I'm real impressed with people, you know, who started drinking in a bar in Fresno and end up in Rio de Janeiro with $600,000 worth of jewels and a body in the next room. I love those stories, you know? But it's not my story. And when I told these people with whom I had nothing in common that I hadn't had a drink since Tuesday night, they burst into applause. And that had never happened to me before. Before, if I told friends of mine that I hadn't had a drink in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, you know, depending on what it was at that time, they never clapped. They would look embarrassed, or they'd change the subject, or they'd ask the children to leave the room. You know, they don't understand. It's like you say, today I'm 5 years sober, I haven't had a drink in 5 years, and they would say, oh, I'm so sorry. Not understanding. Well, that was my introduction to AA, and at that meeting also I was told 3 true things. I mean, there were a number of true things were said, but I mean, this is the ones I remembered. And I can remember for a long time, people in Alcoholics Anonymous would be talking about the program. How's your program? We have a program. And I hate asking questions because I don't like anyone thinking that I don't know what I'm doing. So I have spent years smiling and laughing when everyone else smiles and laughs, you know, and not asking, what's the program? Of course they read chapter 5, but who pays attention to that? What I was told at this meeting by a very big man who had just been let out of jail, who got sober in jail, that at Alcoholics Anonymous we go to lots of meetings, which I did not know, and I was very tired when I got here. I was exhausted when I got here. I didn't have a lot of energy for much of anything when I got here, and so I thought if I rested a lot, I could maybe make a couple of meetings a month. You know. We go to lots of meetings. Then he said, and we don't drink in between meetings, which had never occurred to me. Never occurred to me. I'm glad he didn't say, we don't do this a day at a time. Now, the reason I'm glad he didn't say that was because I had heard day at a time years before, and I tried it, and it didn't work. Because being bright, I know that it says day at a time, but I know it means forever. So, therefore, I could not sustain it. And we're just doing this a day at a time for the next zillion years. Just can't sustain it. But when he said, we don't drink in between meetings, I took him literally. And I said, if I went to a meeting a night, this whole thing would be easier. And meetings in Berkeley at that time started at 8:30 and ended at 10, which is the way God likes them. And what occurred to me is if I went to a meeting tonight at 8:30, and I would not go to a morning or a daytime meeting for my first 3 years of sobriety. I didn't think they counted. I really didn't. I was very flexible when I got sober. So crazy. 8:30 to 10, then all I had to do was not drink until 8:30 the next night, which is not 24 hours. It's 22 and a half. And for some reason, where 24 hours was not possible, 22 and a half hours was possible. I think it's like they advertise some things now that are affordable. It means it's very expensive, but if you don't eat for 6 years, you can afford it. It was that this became affordable to me where 24 was impossible, just too expensive. So we go to lots of meetings, we don't drink in between meetings, and then he said, and we don't use no dope. Which is another one of those things that never occurred to me. I had been smoking non-habit-forming marijuana every day for 7 years. Especially when I wasn't drinking, when you need it, And it never occurred to me not to smoke dope. And when he said it, though, there wasn't a maybe or a perhaps or why don't you give it a try. He spoke with all of the convictions of the lifer, And he said, just out of jail, we don't do it. And I was so confused and so broken and so desperate that I just believed him. And so at that August meeting in the middle of, on a Friday night in 1976 is when I termed my sobriety. I did go into a hospital after that. I went into a 21-day program, not because I was drunk, but because I was paralyzed. See, I used booze to function, and my function was at about 12%, okay, but I still was able to show up a lot. But without the booze, I couldn't function at all. And so I had to go to a nice, safe little place for a while where they'd feed you and encourage you to wash yourself and things like that. And it was a place that was very heavily oriented towards AA, and what they told us there was no matter how good your treatment facility is, you can leave a 3-month program or a 30-day program or a 10-day program, and if you do not go to AA, you'll drink again. If you do go to AA, you never have to take another drink. And that's one of the other things I just believed. And so I started going to lots of meetings. But what my program was for over my first year of sobriety was what Gary said at the meeting. I went to a lot of meetings, I didn't drink in between meetings, and I didn't use no dope. And then, of course, they would talk about steps. And I guess I even read chapter 5 on occasion at a meeting, and I could not figure out what those 12 steps had to do with me. I just couldn't do it. What step are you on? I guess number 1. Now, the first step to my, and I got a sponsor too, because they kept asking me, do you have a sponsor? And I hated saying no, 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 and I didn't want to lie unless I absolutely had to. So I finally got a sponsor, a guy named James, who was younger than me, and he was a Vietnam vet, and he was a year or two sober, so he was an expert. Tattoos up and down his arm. And James asked me to read chapter 5, and he said, well, what do the steps say to you? We're in Berkeley, remember. What do they say to you? And I looked at the 12 steps, and I figured, well, I guess step number 1 says that I admitted that I was powerless over alcohol and that my life had become unmanageable. And he said, no, it doesn't. So I said, well, he wants it rephrased. Step 1 says that I agreed and acknowledged that I didn't have any power at all over booze, and then my life was a mess. And he said, Tom, it doesn't say that. So I tried one more time with some other changing of the words. I had teachers like that, and the game was read their mind, what's going on inside there. And I finally said, I don't understand. And he said, Tom, nowhere in the 12 steps does the word I appear. It says we, baby, because this is a program that we share together. If you want to live in the world of I, have a little drink and go back to your room. And he said, this is a program where you start dealing with the rest of the human race, which I resented very much. But looking back, I did stay on step one for a very long time. And if I were to translate step one into a short little phrase, and this isn't changing the step, but I think what it really says is, it's awful. It doesn't say, gee, it's inconvenient. No. It says, this is really awful. And until we're willing to admit that this is really awful, we don't change anything. I sure don't. I don't change because of mild inconvenience, and I don't change because something seems like it may make me a little happier. I change when it's awful. You see? And I find dealing with some newcomers, and I sponsor some very lucky people, when you know, they will start talking. You know, I got my sponsor. Okay, once you have your sponsor, what do you do with them? Has that question ever come up at a meeting? And what I would hear at meetings is you wait until it's really awful, and then you call them. And you say, sponsor, this is awful. You say. And so that's what I would wait until it was really awful, then I would call James and say, this is really awful, and he would say, what step are you working? And I would say, step one. Right? It's awful! And my awful is bigger than your awful! Well, he then pointed out that this is not a one-step program. And I was insulted. I could follow the thought of step one. I mean, that step one, once I reflected for a couple of months, really held together very nicely. But these other steps were Greek to me. And I was a college graduate. I just couldn't figure out the words. And so we came to step two, and came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now, this for me has been the hardest step. This step absolutely baffled me for the longest time. Steps 4 and 5 are just inconvenient. You know, they're not the tough ones. Step 2 is the tough one for me. And the reason it's the tough one is because step 2 says I have to come to a position of believing that I could get well. And I never believed I could. I just couldn't. What do you believe about God? Power greater than yourself. Well, I've always believed that God was wonderful. I really did. I was taught that when I went to Catholic schools. I was taught that God was loving. I sometimes think I'm the only Catholic in North America that had that teacher. You know, God. That God loved people, that God liked to be with people, that God took people out to lunch. I mean, all those things I believed. And I believed that for you. And what I was also taught was that God is a loving God who loves Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Buddhists and even atheists, although the atheists will be a little surprised. But that was God. You see, that was God's job. That's what God did best. And I bought that for everybody but me. Because for some reason, when it came to me, God's grace couldn't work. It ran out just before it got to me. So I did not have an angry God. I had an indifferent God. The kind of God who looked in my direction and couldn't quite remember my name, but loved everybody else. Now, this is arrogance of a high order. Arrogance kills in two ways. Number one, I'm better than all of you. I may as well start drinking immediately. Or number two, I'm worse than all of you. But whatever works for you cannot work for me. Step 2 says, what works for us works for us. For you too. Come on into the... And I just fought this with... I thought I'd be losing my integrity if I took the second step. I thought I'd be losing me if I took the second step, because I didn't want to believe that a power greater than myself existed in the world. I thought I was the greatest power. I thought I could checkmate, block, or stop any move on God's part. And that'll keep you drunk for years. Sure kept me miserable for a long time. And when I was around 3 months sober, I went into therapy, and the book says we can. Let me see here. Let me just... On page 133, in my copy it's underlined, it says, God has abundantly supplied this world with fine doctors, psychologists, and practitioners of various kinds. Do not hesitate to take your health problems to such persons. I had them, and I went. See, the story of my drinking, there wasn't a lot of external damage. But internally, I was a disaster area. I was completely shut down. I was very damaged. I felt no feelings at all. I was just opaque. I was sedated. I was numb from my head to my toes. And when the booze and alcohol started leaving, I started waking up. And I did not wake up polite. 3 months sober, aren't you glad to be here? 3 months sober, I was just starting to feel the first feelings I felt in years, and they were rage. Generic yellow rage. It wasn't like, gee, I'm angry about X, Y, and Z. I was just angry all the time about everything. And I'd go to meetings where we could swear and use the F word and act out. And we weren't told, that's not very ladylike. You're not acting like a gentleman. Thank God. We weren't ladies and gentlemen. We were drunks trying to get sober. You know, and it made a big difference. So I swore a lot for the first 4 years on this program. I recommend it. Then a point came up where I didn't have to do it anymore, unless I really wanted to, you know, which I think is a freedom. But I started, you know, with all the rage and the fear, and I stayed very, very angry for the next 18 months. And it was just relentless. I mean, they talk about sometimes someone who is stone cold, sober, and crazy, and that was me. Stark raving sober, some people say. My therapist, whose name was Leonard, was a very healing presence in my life, and I found out after a while that I would try to trust him. And so one day I asked him, I said, Leonard, do you think I'm normal? And he looked at me with wise Jewish eyes and said, normal is 98.6. Well, I knew that I had asked the wrong question again, and that I was bad. And instead he rephrased it and said, I think what you're trying to ask is, are you healthy? And I said, you know, I've never even thought of that question, am I healthy? Because I've had sickness fantasies all my life. I never, even in the wildest conception, imagined that I was a healthy person. So I would never ask the question. But I said, what do you mean by healthy? And we talk a lot on the program about sanity. Well, sanity doesn't mean just thinking logical thoughts. You know, if someone is sane, that person is mentally and psychologically and emotionally healthy. That's a sane person. And I'll describe that a little bit more. But I thought at first it was someone who was normal, you know, or sane people were logical people. I've worked some in hospitals, and I find that some people who are locked up are some of the most rigorously honest, logical people in the world. They're so logical they can't function. You know, logic is part of living, it's not all of living. I used to always be afraid of, I have such strange thoughts, they'll think I'm crazy. They only know you're crazy when you act on them. And my problem, as my second sponsor pointed out to me, Terry, who is a hopeless alcoholic in Los Angeles, he would say, Tom, your problem is not your insights. Your problem is your action. This is not a program of insight. This is a program of action. action. So we're going to learn how to start changing our behavior. I hate talk like that. Hate it. Anyway, the doctor mentioned this healthy thing, and I said, "Doctor, how do you spot a healthy person? I haven't been hanging out with a lot of them recently." And he said, "A healthy person is capable of doing 3 kinds of things. Number 1, healthy persons are capable of working. Number 2, healthy persons are capable of loving. And number 3, healthy persons are capable of playing. If you can work, love, and play, you're a pretty healthy person. Now, you can't do all 3 all the time, you know, but if you're capable of that, like over the course of a year, you get all 3 in, you're doing real well." Well, I had to ask him about work, being a graduate student. And he said what my alcoholism did was it destroyed my ability to work. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You know, you were a teacher," and I was. And the thing was, if you're a teacher, they expect you to show up in the classroom as often as the kids do. And when I was drinking, I could show up anywhere once, and I could show up a lot of places twice, and I could show up some places 3 times. But it started getting real risky after that. So I had a little instability record. Work. To love, you need to trust. And he said, "When have you ever trusted anybody?" And as far as play, I almost had to ask him to spell the word. See, I was raised, the morality of my family is work, and we respect work. Good people work. It is the Protestant work ethic, and we liked it. Good people work, and better people work all the time. And what I believe, in fact, I've used this for years, whenever I started feeling guilty or less than or insecure, I just work harder. You know, and if I work hard enough, I'll be a good guy. Well, Leonard said, "What do you do on your days off?" And I said, "I don't take days off." And that was said with pride. You know, "I'm always busy doing something." Well, I was sober a couple of years and started having chest pains in the numb left arm. And one of the true things in the world, a spiritual truth, if I may share that with you, is that the body doesn't lie. See? When it wants to give you a message, it will give you a message. And if you don't want to pay attention, it'll come back stronger next week. Well, chest pains, numb left arm. I was sitting at a Dodger game in Los Angeles. I go to one baseball game every 25 years. And I was sitting next to a fellow about 10 years older than me who had a lot of open heart surgery recently, and so we talked about it. And while around the 4th inning, I noticed that my left arm was completely numb, and I couldn't breathe. And then I said, "Well, maybe this will go away by the 7th inning stretch." You see? God forbid I should mention to anybody. But I was debating in my head, maybe I should tell Charlie to drop me off at the hospital on the way back, you know, just for a checkup, because I think I'm having a heart attack. Every 35-year-old man has these symptoms, I'm sure, you know. What do you mean play? We work all the time. We're not working, we're worried. You know, that's real activity. But I didn't mention it to Charlie at all, but I did take the next week off, and I went down to Santa Barbara, and I lived on the beach for a week, and I just kind of sat there and watched the waves come in. People walk back and forth on the beach, and if you've been there 3 days, they think you're a resident. So we started talking, and I talked to one man every morning, hello, 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 and about day 3, he sat down and said, "Have you just moved here?" And I said, "I'm just here for a little R&R." And he said, "Really, R&R?" He said, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 36. And he said, "And you're taking time off?" He said, "That's amazing." Now, when he was talking, he had this funny little speech impediment. Couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't a foreign accent, but the rhythm was wrong, you know, and like he wasn't quite a native English speaker. So I thought I'd just listen like Henry Higgins and figure this out. And he said, "You know, when I was 36 years old, I had an office in Seattle and an office in San Francisco and an office in LA, and I was moving all the time, and I was making a huge amount of money, and I never took time off." And then he said, and then when I was 40, I had my stroke. And it took me a year to learn how to talk again. And I said to myself, this is God talking to me, you know. And so I said, tell me about your stroke. And he did, and we talked about it. And while he was talking, I had this great revelation that I could wait to change my behavior after my stroke, or I could change my behavior before my stroke, which is another freedom. And then once I realized I think I wanted to change my behavior, at least I had the desire for the desire, the next question was, how do you do it? And the answer is you start learning how to play. Real hard. It's still real hard. I find what I do best for play is I work in the yard. It is working in the yard, but it's play for me. Play is something, the word I prefer to use rather than play a lot of times is recreation. Recreation, to recreate my insides. And what does that, what helps build back my soul and build back my spirit and build back my humanity is working outside in the yard or cooking. Those two things do it for me. Other people do woodwork or go hunting or backpacking or live by the ocean or paint. You know, Winston Churchill discovered painting during the Second World War, something he could do for recreation during the Blitz. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now, what I just didn't think that I could be restored to a place where I could ever work, love, and play. I didn't think it was possible. But I kept going to meetings. And one night, I was at a meeting called Berkeley Wednesday Night on University Avenue. And I had a spiritual awakening. As a matter of fact, I think I had 2 or 3 of them all at once. What's a spiritual awakening? Well, if you see the movies a lot, spiritual awakenings are when the Red Sea parts, or when you start hearing the Mormon Tabernacle Choir humming in the background. You know it's coming, you know. When I was drinking a little, I used to go to churches of my denomination, and I'd sit in the back and I'd look at one of the statues and say something like, if there really is a God, wave back. Now, sometimes they did, you know. Quick little waves. And then I'd say, do that again, you know. I wasn't going to be taken for a ride. Well, those aren't spiritual awakenings. Those are hallucinations. And it takes a couple of years of sobriety and a sponsor who's a fascist to sort through a lot of that stuff. A spiritual awakening is something that changes our attitudes and our behavior for the better. That's a spiritual awakening, and anything else is wasting our time. You know? So sometimes an insight can be a spiritual awakening if the insight changes behavior. I was sitting at this meeting in Berkeley. I was 6 or 8 or 9 months sober, and I looked around the room, and I noticed for the first time that I was not alone in the room. That there were other people there who also had a right to be there. Now, I had a little ego problem. My problem was I didn't think I had a right to be there. See, I was such a bad drunk, I never even got a tattoo, you know? I mean, I was just dying, you know, and that surely isn't required, you know, for admission. I never went to jail. I never got a drunk driving ticket. I never had 17 wives. You know, I just was dying by inches for years. But I realized everybody in the room has a right to be here, and Tom, you're in the room. You've got a right to be here too. And that just felt, that first sense of belonging happened then. And I consider that a spiritual awakening because it's changed my actions. I kept coming back, and I started letting people in bit by bit by bit. The second thing that happened is, this second step. I mean, how could God deal with me? I asked God to deal with me a lot earlier. It never worked. But I looked and I realized that sitting in that room, I hadn't had a drink or a joint or a pill for over 9 months. And that was surprising, but more surprising was the realization that I didn't do it. Therefore, I could conclude that a power greater than myself was finally in my life. I'm very grateful to this step that it says we came to believe. It doesn't say we came to feel, because feelings come and go. But I can believe, even on a bad day, that a power greater than myself is restoring me to a place where I can work, love, and play, and that's sanity for me. And I remember this sense of joy that came in when I realized that maybe, just maybe, God is even operating in my life. Not just in yours, but maybe I was even entering the human race little by little, and I became aware of the fact that I was willing to be a member of the human race, but on my terms. And then I realized that wouldn't work. And I had to be a member of the human race on the human race's terms. And I became willing to do that. And then I was sober a year, and I didn't feel real good. I thought you were supposed to feel wonderful when you were sober a year, and I was depressed. Because I hadn't had a drink or a joint or a pill for a year, and I still felt lousy. A lot. I was still angry at everything. A couple of months ago, before I went to Europe, I went to a meeting at Berkeley Wednesday night on University Avenue again, and we used to call it the open ward. And it still is. It's just a wonderful place. I feel so at home there. And we were sharing, the topic was, it was something very obscure, like, what do you hope to achieve from the program? And so when you start using big words, people start using big words. And we were sharing about how we want relationships and all this stuff, and all very theoretical stuff. And about 8 people into the meeting, they called on this new guy who said, he was about 3 months sober. He said, "I'm just hoping I can stop shaking one of these days." And I'm so glad he talked, because up to that time I thought I was at the wrong meeting. And that I didn't belong, because I still am amazed at the fact that I'm not shaking as much as I used to. I am amazed at the fact that I'm not drunk today. I mean, I am grateful at the fact that I didn't have a little white wine for breakfast. I meet people and they say, "Tom, how are you?" And I say, "I'm sober." And they said, "Well, you're supposed to be." They forget that I'm an alcoholic. And we're supposed to be drunk or dead. What we're doing here this morning is unnatural, Worse, we laugh about it. And we just think it's sensational that we're not peeing on ourselves at the moment. Very strange. Very strange. But when I was a year sober, I was standing on a street corner in Berkeley talking to a very tall Al-Anon, about 6.5 feet tall. And while we were talking about something, I guess we were talking about the future, which is always a good topic. And I became aware of the fact that I did not know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I was 30 years old. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I had been in the seminary for years, and I was, when I got sober in Berkeley, I was in school studying theology, and I knew a lot, and I knew a lot of real good stuff. I just could never apply it to me. It was just like I was the exception to every good case. And while I was talking to John on the street in Berkeley, what occurred to me was that if I went to lots of meetings, if I didn't drink in between meetings, and if I didn't use no dope, I could leave the order and my life would be fine. If I went to lots of meetings, if I didn't drink in between meetings, and if I didn't use no dope, I could stay in the order and my life would be fine. So the question is, what's reasonable? And it occurred to me that it'd be reasonable to give it a try, day at a time. And so on April 1st, 1978, I was ordained to active ministry, and I still function in active ministry, which at times surprises me as much as it surprises them. And the reason I'm able to function at all is because of the emotional and spiritual support I find in Alcoholics Anonymous. I could not function without you. And this becomes very clear to me, and it doesn't make any difference what language you're speaking, or what national background you come from, or what part of the state you live in. If you're speaking the language of the heart, if you're speaking the language of the Spirit, I can connect if I let myself be open to this. So at about a year's sobriety, I did the third step. I made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand God. Figuring this could only be a terrible mistake. And part of the problem with turning it over, see, I love token gestures. I'm more than willing to do a token gesture, but what happens if God takes it? You see? Then where do I end up? And I'm very afraid of losing control. I really am. I mean, I propose stuff and I want it done that way. And right now at 10 years sober, what I am almost sure of is anything I propose is not going to work. Something else happens. Usually ends up much better and much happier if I just turn it over and let go. But I had to believe that a power greater than myself could be trusted. I just didn't need a power greater than myself. I needed a power greater than myself that was intelligent and benevolent. And I found, again, my own experience. If this power can get me sober and keep me sober and introduce me to you, this power has intelligence and benevolence. And I can continue trusting this power one day at a time. I talked about rewording step 1 to "it's awful." If I would reword step 2, it would be somehow, somewhere in the universe, there is a solution. What's it look like? Doesn't make any difference. How much does it cost? It's free. What language does it speak? Doesn't make any difference. You know, just somehow, somewhere in the universe, in the cosmos, there is something that can solve my problem, because I can't. I am absolutely powerless with alcohol and a long list of other things. And then step 3, how do you turn it over? You know, well, my first sponsor, he would turn it over. I turned it over. And I'd be waiting for results, you know. Or I'd go to my room, sit in the chair alone, trying to turn it over. I don't think that works. My experience, when I'm alone in my room, I'm in bad company. And turning it over and making a decision to turn our will and our lives over, that's a process. That's a process, the turning over. And how do people turn their will and their lives over? It's not willpower, gang. Willpower never worked for me for anything. I tried to explain that to people who are not compulsive. It's impossible. Because they have willpower. My mother, well... That's another program. Oi, oi, oi. Anyway, I think looking at women and men getting well for the past 10 years, what I've seen is this. People turn it over by doing three things. People who turn it over show up. Yeah. Show up where? To meetings, to work, to responsibilities, to life, to today. We show up. Number two, we pay attention to what's going on inside of me and inside of you. Now, a lot of times I've shown up and I've never paid attention at all. I know I was there because I've seen the pictures. But and this is sober. This is not after a couple of social drinks. This is 5 years sober, and you mean I married you? I have no recollection, but there I am, right in there in the church. I have to learn how to pay attention. Show up, pay attention. And number three, what I have to do is tell the truth. If I show up, pay attention, and tell the truth, I get out of God's way enough so that God can do whatever God needs to do with me. Well, aren't I supposed to understand God before I take this step? No one understands God. God understands God. That's God's job. What we get are little glimmerings, like what do I know after all these years of theology and sobriety and meetings and stuff? Number one, God is very big. That much I know. God is very big. What's also true about God is that God is an equal opportunity lover. God can't love me because I'm a drunk. God can't love me because I'm white. God can't love me because I'm a foreigner. God can't love me because I'm an immigrant. God can't love me because I don't have a college education. God can't love me because I'm gay. God can't love me because I come from the wrong part of town. God is an equal opportunity lover. And this needs to get talked about a lot, Very big, loves us all. This also means that God has no taste. And stuff that you and I would never put up with. God puts up with all the time. It's just amazing. That's why I'm glad God has the job. Most of my trouble with God comes from the fact that I make God too small. I just do. I make God so small, God can't deal with X, Y, or Z. God is very big. And God can even handle my stuff. My stuff. So I try to show up. I try to show up a lot. I try to pay attention, and I try to tell the truth. And who do you tell the truth to? Well, it starts to myself, and then I mention it to my sponsor, and then I might mention it to my home meeting, if they're in a good mood. Sometimes they're awful. I did steps 4 and 5 when I was about 2 years sober, and then other steps in succeeding years of sobriety, and I'm of the opinion that the first 5 years of sobriety are real early years of sobriety. So many of us compete, and competing is very alcoholic. We're 3 months sober and are still waiting for X, Y, and Z to happen. I'm a year sober and don't yet have the perfect relationship. Some of us think, that by the time we do our 5th step, we should be making $100,000 a year. Those aren't anywhere in the promises. In fact, my first sponsor, James, he thought, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, James gets laid. He knew that was in there somehow. And it just wasn't there, until finally his sponsor pointed out that he was interpreting the step a little bit. Having had a spiritual awakening, we try to carry the message, and the message we carry is, this has worked for me, this can work for you. This is my experience. This is how I got here. And this is what is alive for me today. I still have trouble with God. I still have trouble with prayer and meditation. I still have trouble believing, and that's why I need to continue coming to meetings, because when I come to meetings, I find women and men who should be dead are sober, are wearing their own clothes, you know, and are telling the truth, and I need to hear that. The story is told in Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. He talks in there about when he was, right after World War I, 1918-1919, he went out with a group of buddies and he got drunk for the first time in his life. And he got drunk, he had a blackout, he doesn't remember most of the evening. He says he woke up the next morning feeling absolutely hysterical and devastated and humiliated and grim, and it was the worst thing he ever experienced in his entire life, and he took a solemn vow to never have another drink again for as long as he lived, which is a promise he kept. And I'd like to point this out as a good example of what happens when you don't drink and don't go to meetings. I was at the Berkeley Fellowship last week. I was sitting there at the noontime meeting. I even go to noontime meetings. For a couple years, I just allowed other people to go, but then I started going myself. And someone came up and she said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm not drinking. What are you doing here?" You know. Okay, it makes me nervous. I want to mention one thing, and then I'm going to end with my favorite story. I have to leave right after this because there is a woman and a man in Fremont who expect me to marry them today. They're on the program, so I'm sure they're turning it all over. But they were originally, the wedding was scheduled for 11 o'clock this morning. And then they were going to have a reception, and I called them after I got back from Sweden. And I said, "Gee, you know, I'm going to be talking at this convention. Remember I mentioned that to you?" And they said, "Oh, yeah." And I said, "So I'll be talking about 10:30. So what we agreed is they'll have the reception first and the wedding afterwards." So I need to get there this afternoon, so I'm not going to hang around a bunch. I'm going to split real fast and try to help their serenity. But I find sober, I become capable of learning. Now, I'm not willing to learn all the time. In fact, if the truth were to be told, there are only a couple of times a year when I'm willing to learn anything. But when that comes upon me, I like to take advantage of it. And 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, the Spirit came upon me to learn something, and I started taking a series of classes from the Orthodox rabbi of Berkeley. And he was teaching a class in Jewish theology, and I figure, being that Jesus was Jewish and so was his mother, and you know, anything I learn about being Jewish, I learn about my own tradition, and so I'm always interested in learning. And so I started taking the class there, and the rabbi knew who I was, and it was an adult education class, and most of the other people there were either born Jewish but had never done anything about it, so they were rediscovering roots, or Gentiles who were converting, and then there was me. So one evening the rabbi was talking about different stuff, and his father was a rabbi, and his father was a rabbi, and his father was a rabbi, long tradition. And this woman in class raised her hand, and she said, "Rabbi, I want to ask a question." And he said, "Sure." And she said, "Rabbi, what is a blessing?" Now, I don't know what you know about rabbis, but rabbis never answer a direct question with a direct answer. It's against the rules. You can't do it. And it's an ancient tradition, so that if you were to ask a rabbi, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" any rabbi worth his salt would respond, "Whose picture is on the coin?" You see? "Caesar's. Give it to him. Next." You know, that kind of stuff. So you answer with questions whenever you can, and if you can't answer with a question, you tell a story. So what the rabbi did, man was on the road to Jericho, and what the rabbi did was tell a story. He said, she said, "What is a blessing?" And first he started fooling with his beard, which is why we have beards. And he said, when God created the world, God created the world in 6 days. And at the end of each day of creation, God looked at what God had made and said, "This is good. This is good." So God created dry land from the chaos and said it was good, and God created the sun and the moon and the stars and said they were good, and God created goats and vegetation and trees and fish and said they were good. And on the 6th day of creation, God looked at what God had made and said, "Nothing," after making the human being. And the rabbi said, "Any conclusions?" And someone in the class said, "People are no good." And the rabbi said, "That's a possible conclusion. And that's why it's a bad translation," he said. In English, good means too many things. You have a good book, and you have the good book, and you have good people, and a good date, and a good evening, and a good day, and a good apple. Good has all these nuances and overtones. It's very confusing, he said. In Hebrew, and then he looked at me and said, "Which is what God spoke." In Hebrew, he said, God looked at what God had made and said, "This is Tov," T-O-V, as in Victor, Tov. And what does it mean when something is Tov? It means something is complete. It means it's whole. It means it's entire. It means it's wholesome. It means it's exactly the way it's supposed to be. It can't be any different. So the rabbi said, God created fish and cows and goats and the land and the sun complete. They're not going to change. But people, he said, people God did not create complete. People God created with a lot of holes, with a lot of empty places. And the rabbi said, therefore, in the course of a lifetime, what is a person supposed to do? A person is supposed to fill in some of those holes. A person is supposed to get bigger. A person is supposed to become more of a human being. A person is supposed to be more of a mensch, more of a human being. And the rabbi paused for a second and said, as we travel down life's journey, as we walk the path, as we're trudging the road of happy destiny, anything that gets behind us and pushes us forward, anything that gets in front of us and drags us ahead, anything that gets down deep inside of us where it's dark and cold and brittle and angry, anything that gets down there and kicks and shoves and pushes and elbows until suddenly there's more room, anything that does that, said the rabbi, is a blessing. And he said, lots of times blessings don't feel good. And lots of times you don't know they're blessings till years later. And you look back on a situation that you knew was going to kill you. And you find out that it opened doors that you never even knew were there. And when he said that for the first time, it occurred to me why alcoholism is the greatest blessing of my life. Because it found me someone who was very unhappy and very brittle and very bigoted and very nuts. And today, I'm bigger. All those problems are still there. But if I show up pay attention and tell the truth, God can do something about those in the 6th and 7th steps. What we're supposed to do at a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous is share our experience and our strength and our hope. My experience, strength, and hope is simply this. If we go to lots of meetings, if we don't drink in between meetings, and if we don't use no dope, one day at a time, we can grow into women and men who are capable of working and loving and playing. Thank you.
Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.